I was so screwed. In my past life, my sister got snatched up by some rich family, and I ended up with a freaking cleaning lady. Turns out, the high society life was a war zone. Cold parents, a bully for a brother, and she ended up with absolutely nothing after a nasty divorce. My life? Picture perfect. A loving family, a total dream, and a hotshot millionaire who fell head over heels for me, the poor little nobody. Straight out of a rom-com. Jealous as hell, my sister ran me over with her car, sending us both back to the day we got adopted. Now, she's making a beeline for the cleaning lady, screaming. This time, I'm playing the leading lady, not you. Too bad for her. Being the main character isn't about what you're born into. My sister and I woke up in the orphanage, reliving the day we were supposed to get adopted. Two families were standing in the director's office, the Garretts and the Millers. The Garretts, all three of them, were decked out. Mr. Garrett was in a tailored suit, and Mrs. Garrett dripped in jewels. Their son, Chad Garrett, looked like he'd just stepped out of a private school catalog, complete with limited edition sneakers. The Garretts were basically royalty in this town. Mr. Garrett owned half the city, and Mrs. Garrett was always plastered across gossip magazines. Chad was the golden prince. Next to them, the Millers looked like they'd crawled out of a coal mine. Their hands were rough, their clothes were worn, but they seemed nice enough. The director said they both worked at the local high school. He was a janitor and she was a custodian. Last time, my sister, Tiffany, didn't hesitate for a second before latching herself onto the Garretts. But not this time. She all but dove into the Millers' arms. "Mommy, take me home. I want to be your daughter. From now on, call me Tiffany Miller." With Tiffany practically vibrating with excitement, I walked over to the Garretts. And just like that, it was done. We were officially adopted. As we left the orphanage, I heard the director muttering to herself. "That's strange. Tiffany's usually all about the fanciest stuff. If someone looked poor, she wouldn't even glance at them. Why didn't she choose the rich family?" The director didn't get it. But I did. Last time, Tiffany clawed her way into the Garretts' lives, becoming Tiffany Garrett. She thought she was walking into a fairy tale, especially with Chad Garrett as her big brother. A rich guy and his adopted sister? It was practically a romance novel trope. Living under the same roof, sparks were bound to fly. But Tiffany never saw it coming. Chad didn't treat her like a princess, he loathed her. "I can't stand gold diggers. Don't think I don't see right through you. You only want our money." At home, Chad made Tiffany's life hell. At school, he and his pack of goons bullied her mercilessly. And her adopted parents? They barely lifted a finger. They didn't give a damn about Tiffany. They only took her in because some fortune teller told Mr. Garrett that adopting a daughter would bring him good luck. Obviously, they were always going to side with their real son. While Chad was torturing Tiffany, he was being all sweet and charming with me. The nobody who got stuck with the Millers. He saw me struggling, getting scholarships, working my butt off in school and helping my mom clean at night, never complaining. That Violet Miller. There's something about her. Just like in a movie, the spoiled rich kid fell for the scrappy poor girl. Later, when the Garrett parents died, Chad brought in a team of lawyers and left Tiffany with absolutely nothing. She didn't get a dime. A few months later, Chad and I got married. He even said in front of everyone, "Violet, what's mine is yours." Too bad I didn't get to enjoy any of it. Because a few days later, Tiffany, driven insane by jealousy, ran me over with her car. Now here we are reliving that day. Tiffany thinks she's finally going to live the good life. A loving family, and then some rich guy will come along to shower her with love. She'll have a fairy tale wedding. She actually smiled at me, all smug. This time, I'm going to be the main character. And you can finally see what it's like to be in my shoes. Tiffany's predictions started coming true right away. Chad's bullying started sooner than I thought. Some guys were dunking my head into a freaking toilet, laughing like hyenas. Just as I was about to pass out, someone yanked me up by the hair. Chad was smirking. "You want our money so bad? Drink the water from the toilet, and I'll give you 100 grand a gulp. How's that sound?" His cronies were cheering. I just stared at Chad. The guy who'd whispered sweet nothings and promises of love was now using me as his personal punching bag. But Chad wasn't even looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me. I knew what it was. Tiffany was scrubbing the floor. "Isn't that Tiffany Miller? Why's she cleaning?" One of Chad's friends told him. "Her mom's a custodian here. She goes to school during the day and helps her mom out at night." Chad's face changed. Shock, then a hint of something like pity. He yelled at Tiffany, "Hey, it's freezing out here. You don't need to clean that." Tiffany stood up, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, her face a picture of determination. She shook her head. "I have to. If the floor isn't clean, Mom will get docked $100. I know that's nothing to you, but it's my family's food for a week." And she went back to scrubbing. Tiffany was so obvious. All those floors, and she just happened to pick the one in front of Chad. She even let her hair down and struck a pose. And Chad ate it right up. He rushed over, grabbed the rag from her hands and tossed it to his friends. You guys finished the floor. He glanced at Tiffany's red hands, then took off his jacket and put it around her shoulders. How are you getting home? Bike. In this weather? Chad was stunned. Wait for me downstairs, and I'll get my driver to take you home. Chad led Tiffany away. Before she left, she looked back at me and smirked. A few minutes later, everyone was gone. I was alone by the toilet. I struggled to my feet and wiped the water from my face. Here. A quiet voice spoke behind me. I turned around. It was Sophie Baker, the valedictorian. She was the quiet type. She worked hard and always wore long sleeves, no matter the weather. Last time, she tried to help Tiffany when she was being bullied. She gave Tiffany a towel and tried to convince her to expose Chad's abuse. But Tiffany slapped her hand away. He's my brother. Tiffany was too busy dreaming of Chad falling in love with her. Sophie just gave up on her and went back to being alone. Then near graduation, she killed herself. We found out her family was dirt poor. Her grandma was sick, and her dad was a gambling addict who abused her and tried to sell her to pay off his debts. Now, she was standing next to me with a clean towel. I took it, surprised. She didn't say anything, just turned to leave. She probably didn't think she had anything in common with a rich girl like me. As she walked away, I called out, Sophie. She stopped. I shrugged. I'm new here and I'm lost. Where's the cafeteria? Can you show me? The table in the cafeteria was covered in food. Fried ribs, steamed egg with meat, chicken wings, stir-fried vegetables, and a clam soup. The school cafeteria was something to be proud of. I shrugged again. Whoops, I ordered too much. Waste is a sin, and you probably haven't eaten dinner, right? Want to share? Sophie was silent for a second, and then she picked up her chopsticks and started to eat. Iwatitya. Her wrists were so thin, her sleeves were hiding something. Girls like Sophie really needed help, but they were never noticed, and they never whined. So they just became the background, never the main character. This time, I was going to save myself, and I was going to save her. With that in mind, I started. Calculus is so hard. I don't understand anything. You're so smart, could you tutor me? Sophie looked at me stunned. Do we even know each other? I didn't give her a chance to say no. I threw my arm around her shoulders. It's settled. I'll pay you. I gave Sophie some of my allowance, calling it a tutor fee. She stared at the money, speechless. The Garretts weren't exactly stingy, but what was pocket change for Chad could pay for Sophie's grandma's medicine. She could even rent an apartment and get away from her abusive father. After we set up a time to study, I went home. The huge mansion was empty. Mr. Garrett was out on business, and Mrs. Garrett was at a spa. Chad. He was probably having dinner at the Millers. Last time, Chad had his driver drop me off and the Millers had seen him and insisted that he stay for dinner. Then, like a scene from a cheesy movie, the rich kid who'd grown up in a cold mansion felt the warmth of a poor family. The Millers were always smiling. Their house was small and old, but it was full of life. Chad loved it, and it made him fall even harder for the poor girl who lived there. Right now, he and Tiffany were eating some bland dinner, but they were probably happy. I changed into a silk robe, washed my face with expensive cleanser, ate some bird's nest soup, and smirked. Nobody knew that the Millers weren't as innocent as they seemed. They wanted to adopt a boy, but there weren't any available, so they settled for a pretty girl who could marry rich. When they saw Chad, their eyes lit up and they dragged him into their home. The family, and the warmth, were all an act. It was all they had to impress him with. Last time, when I told them I didn't want to marry Chad, my adopted mother locked me in my room, and my father beat me half to death with a chair leg and a belt. Tiffany thought she was walking into paradise, but there was no such thing. The Garretts were a rich hell, and the Millers were a poor one. Whoever survived would be the one with the most guts. As the days passed, Chad's bullying got worse. I opened my lunchbox and found it filled with thumbtacks. I squeezed my toothpaste and a dead spider came out. My dresses were covered in cigarette burns. Every time I jumped, I'd see Chad grinning. He mouthed, "You deserve it." Chad thought I was going to cry, but I just dumped the thumbtacks, threw the spider in the trash, and folded the dresses. Chad's smile faded. He glared at me. How long can you keep this up? At least I had the Garrett's resources on my side. I didn't have to go to school all day and work at night. I had a maid and a driver, and all I had to do was study. Last time, I had to save up to buy books and hide the money from my adopted father. Now my closet was full of designer clothes and jewelry. Mrs. Garrett gave them to me without me even asking. I got a $5,000 allowance and a $10,000 credit card every month. If I ran out, I just told the butler and he'd put more money in my account. Tiffany was living the life I used to have. I saw her sleeping in class because she had to help her adopted mother at night. She didn't do her homework and she failed her tests. Last time, I drank black coffee and stabbed myself with a compass to stay awake. But Tiffany had always lived a life of luxury, and she didn't have the drive or the strength to do that. She thought marrying a rich kid was better than going to college. So Tiffany put all her energy into making Chad like her. She wrote him love letters in math class. She ditched dance practice to go for drives with him. Then, before the dance recital, she sat outside the studio, crying. She must have been studying rom-coms, because she was looking up at the sky, tears welling up in her eyes. Chad saw her and asked what was wrong. Tiffany burst into tears. Chad, I can't be in the show. Everyone else is going on stage, but Violet won't let me participate. Chad hated me anyway, and this made him snap. Why? Tiffany bit her lip. She said my mom's a custodian and my dad's a janitor. I can't afford the costumes, so I don't deserve to be on stage. Chad's face darkened. He looked at Tiffany and said, I'll buy you a costume. Tiffany shook her head. They cost $800. I can't take that. Chad was furious. How dare Violet do that? Tiffany shook her head. She's your sister after all. And the Garretts are big deals. Your family donated money to the school, and your dad's on the board, so what can teachers do, even if she's bullying me? Tiffany didn't notice the reporters who were walking by. They perked up. Bullying? What bullying? It blew up. Everyone was crammed into the school's biggest conference room. The principal, vice principal, teachers, reporters, and both sets of parents were there. The Millers were huddling in a corner with Tiffany, looking furious. The Garretts hadn't wanted to come until they heard the director of the Board of Education was involved. The school was important to the board, and Mr. Garrett knew the director. He came in and said, This is nothing. It's just kids fighting. But the director wasn't having it. Bullying is always a big deal. I know Violet is your daughter, but all the kids are students. I can't let them go astray. Mr. Garrett could only nod. We don't know what happened. Please investigate. He went back to Mrs. Garrett and they exchanged a look. I knew what it meant. If it was proven that I was bullying Tiffany, the Garretts would cut me off. If that was how the Garretts felt, then Chad. He was whispering to Tiffany, shooting me cold looks. The principal said, Tiffany, tell us what happened. Tiffany told the same story she told Chad. The reporters were already angry. We found out that Violet and Tiffany were friends at the orphanage. Then, Violet got adopted by the Garretts, and Tiffany's adopted parents were just school employees. Violet, just because you're rich, does that mean you can bully your old friend and take away her chance? It was silent. The reporters stared at me, their cameras flashing. They wanted a juicy story. This was a touchy subject, see the rich taking advantage of the poor. It was a huge issue. And the main characters were me and Tiffany. In the silence, I laughed. The sound of my laughter was sharp, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls of the conference room. It cut through the whirring of the reporters' cameras and the tense, self-righteous whispers of the school board. Tiffany, who had been huddled in the corner of the room with Mrs. Miller's arm wrapped around her shoulder, flinched. She looked up, her tear-stained face momentarily losing its fragile, victimized composure. What is so funny, Violet? The director of the Board of Education asked, his brow furrowing with deep disapproval. This is a serious allegation. If you have been using your family's influence to systematically exclude another student. I'm laughing because the story is incredibly creative, I said, leaning back in my leather chair. I didn't look like a nervous teenager caught in a scandal. I looked like a Garrett. I reached into my designer blazer, pulled out a neat, stapled stack of papers, and slid them across the long mahogany table. They slid smoothly, stopping right in front of the director. What is this? Mr. Garrett asked, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. It's the dance studio's official registration log and financial receipts for the graduation recital, I said, my voice calm and clear enough for the reporters' microphones to pick up every syllable. About 3 weeks ago, the dance instructor mentioned that several students from lower-income families were struggling to afford the $800 performance costumes. Since my parents are major benefactors of the school, I didn't want anyone to feel left out. I pointed to the highlighted line on the first page. I used my own monthly allowance to anonymously sponsor the costumes for 5 students. The payment went through the school's administrative account. And if you look at the name of the first student on that sponsored list, it's Tiffany Miller. The principal quickly leaned over the director's shoulder, his eyes scanning the document. It really is. Violet paid for Tiffany's costume in full 3 weeks ago. A murmur ran through the reporters. The cameras, which had been pointed at my face, instantly pivoted toward Tiffany. If her costume was paid for, a reporter from the City Daily asked, then why did she claim she was excluded because she couldn't afford it? I didn't take away her chance, I said, looking directly at Tiffany, whose face had gone completely white. She gave it away herself. Principal, could you please read the attendance log from the dance studio for the past month? The dance instructor, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room, stood up. She looked nervous but angry. Tiffany has missed 12 out of the last 15 mandatory rehearsal sessions, the instructor said clearly. Under our school's performance Guidelines: any student who misses more than 3 practices is automatically cut from the final showcase to ensure the safety of the group stunts. I personally delivered the notice to Tiffany last Friday. And where was she during those practices? I asked, raising an eyebrow. The room went dead silent. Everyone looked at Chad, who was sitting next to his mother, his face turning a deep, embarrassed red. Everyone in the school knew that Chad had been skipping his afternoon tutoring sessions to take Tiffany out for joyrides in his sports car. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening click. So, the director of the board said slowly, his tone shifting from disapproval of me to absolute disgust for the Millers. Tiffany Miller skipped her mandatory practices to socialize, got cut from the team according to standard procedures, and then lied to her adopted brother to spark a high-profile bullying scandal. No, that's not, she's lying. Mrs. Miller shrieked, her sweet motherly facade shattering as she grabbed the papers from the table. My Tiffany would never do that. Violet must have forged those receipts. She's rich, she can buy anything. But the school's financial administrator stepped forward, holding a tablet. The transaction was processed through our secure school portal using Violet Garrett's personal credit card. The digital signature is verified. There is no forgery. The reporters began writing furiously on their tablets. The narrative of the rich bully taking advantage of the poor custodian's daughter had completely evaporated, replaced by a much juicier story. Lazy student attempts to defame wealthy classmate after getting cut for poor attendance. Mr. Garrett stood up, his tailored suit immaculate, his face a mask of cold, powerful authority. It seems my daughter has not only been behaving with extreme charity, but she has also been subjected to a malicious smear campaign, Mr. Garrett said, his voice echoing in the silent room. Director, I expect a formal apology from the school, and I expect the Miller family to be held accountable for this slander. He turned to look at Mrs. Miller and Tiffany with a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. And as a member of the school board, I will be reviewing the employment status of the school's custodian staff. We cannot have people of such questionable character working around our children. Tiffany let out a small, strangled gasp, her eyes wide with terror as she realized what she had just done. By trying to play the tragic, scrappy main character, she hadn't just ruined her own reputation. She had just gotten her adopted parents fired. The fallout from the conference room was swift and merciless. Mr. Garrett was a man who valued his public image above all else. Since I had handled the situation perfectly, proving my utility and protecting the Garrett name, his attitude toward me changed overnight. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked orphan daughter. I was his successful PR asset. You did well, Violet, he said during dinner that evening, not even looking up from his prime rib. You handled those reporters like a true Garrett. I've increased your monthly allowance by $5,000. Thank you, Father, I said politely, cutting a small piece of my steak. Across the table, Chad sat in absolute silence. His sports car keys had been confiscated, his credit cards frozen, and Mr. Garrett had threatened to send him to a military boarding school in the Midwest if he was ever seen within 10 feet of Tiffany Miller again. Chad looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of resentment, confusion, and a strange, sudden fear. In his mind, I was supposed to be the weak, crying target of his bullying. Instead, I was the one sitting at the head of the table, receiving his father's praise, while he was treated like a useless liability. But the real drama was happening on the other side of town. 2 days after the conference, Mrs. Vance, the orphanage director, called me privately. Violet, sweetie. Her voice sounded incredibly worried. I shouldn't be telling you this, but I'm so concerned about Tiffany. The school fired both of her parents yesterday because of the scandal. And, well, some of the neighbors in the slum district said they heard screaming from the Miller house last night. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my bedroom, looking out at the manicured lawns. Screaming, Mrs. Vance? I asked, my voice calm. Yes, Mrs. Vance whispered. They said Mr. Miller was furious about losing his pension. He has a bad temper, Violet. When they lived next door to us years ago, there were rumors that he used to drink and, well, I'm just afraid. Tiffany doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. I thanked her and hung up, a cold, dark smile spreading across my lips. I knew exactly what Tiffany had gotten herself into. In our past life, the Millers were always smiling when Chad was around. They looked like the picture of a warm, loving, humble family. But that warmth was a currency they only spent when they thought they could get a return on their investment. They had adopted Tiffany because she was pretty, and because they hoped to use her to trap a wealthy heir like Chad Garrett. Now that Chad's father had threatened them, and their jobs were gone, Tiffany was no longer an asset. She was a mouth to feed, a parasite that had brought ruin to their house. That night, I took my driver and went to the local hospital's pharmacy. I met Sophie Baker there. She was standing by the counter, holding a small paper bag of medicine, her face looking thin and pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Sophie," I called out, walking over to her. She flinched, quickly pulling her long sleeves down over her wrists to hide the dark purple bruises I knew were there. "Violet? What are you doing?" "I was picking up some vitamins," I lied softly, looking at her worn-out sneakers. "How is your grandmother doing?" Sophie looked down, her fingers tightening around the medicine bag. "The doctor said she needs a private nurse, but we can't afford it. My dad, he took our rent money to the casino again yesterday." I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope containing the $5,000 Mr. Garrett had given me as a bonus. I slid it into her hands. "This is your advance tutoring fee for the next 6 months, I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I want us to study every night at the library, and I've already spoken to the head of the hospital's social work department. They're going to arrange a free care program for your grandmother starting tomorrow." Sophie stared at the envelope, her eyes suddenly filling with thick, heavy tears. She looked at me, her shoulders shaking with a quiet, suppressed sob. Why are you helping me, Violet? I'm nobody. I'm just the girl who cleans the library." I reached out, gently wrapping my hand around her thin wrist, feeling the fragile beat of her pulse. "Because you're smart, Sophie," I said softly. "And because nobody deserves to be a background character in someone else's tragedy. We're going to get out of this town together." As the winter gave way to spring, the contrast between my life and Tiffany's became an unbridgeable chasm. With Sophie's help, my academic ranking rose to number 2 in the class, right behind her. We spent our evenings in the quiet, warm corners of the university library, our desks covered in calculus books and college prep essays. Sophie's father had been arrested 2 weeks prior after Mr. Garrett's legal team, acting on my quiet suggestion, helped her file a formal restraining order and an investigation into his illegal gambling debts. With her father gone and her grandmother cared for, Sophie's face had regained its color, her long sleeves no longer hiding bruises, but a pair of neat, silver bracelets I had bought her for her birthday. Meanwhile, Tiffany was drowning. She was failing 3 of her classes. Her hair, which had once been shiny and styled, was dry and tangled, her clothes looking worn out and dirty. She was forced to work part-time at a local fast food joint just to help pay the miller's rent, her fingers smelling of grease and cheap soap. Chad had completely abandoned her. Under the threat of being cut off from his inheritance, the Golden Prince had proved to be exactly what he was, a coward who valued his sports car more than any romantic fantasy. He didn't look at Tiffany in the hallways anymore, he treated her like a leper. But Tiffany wasn't ready to give up her main character dream. One afternoon, right before the spring break, a rumor exploded across the school's online forum. "Did you see the photo? Chad Garrett and Tiffany Miller were seen entering the motel on 8th Street yesterday afternoon. Is she pregnant? Someone said she was throwing up in the girls' restroom this morning." I sat at my desk in the library, looking at the screen of my phone. The play was so obvious, so desperate. In our past life, Tiffany had used a similar rumor to force Mr. Garrett to accept her relationship with Chad, claiming that the Garrett family's reputation would be ruined if the public found out Chad had abandoned a pregnant girl from the slums. But back then, she had the Garrett's resources to protect her. 10 minutes after the rumor went viral, Mr. Garrett's secretary called me. "Violet, your father wants you in his private office at the estate immediately." When I arrived, the study was tense. Mr. Garrett was standing by the window, his face dark with fury. Mrs. Garrett was sitting on the leather sofa, holding a handkerchief to her eyes, while Chad stood in the center of the room, his head bowed, his hands shaking. It was a setup. Chad was screaming, his voice cracking with panic. "I swear, Dad, I didn't touch her. She told me she was sick and needed a ride to the clinic, and then she dragged me into that motel room. There were photographers outside. She set me up. I don't care if it was a setup," Mr. Garrett roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. "The board of directors is meeting tomorrow to discuss our company's public listing. If this white trash girl leaks a story about my son forcing himself on her, our stock value will plummet." He turned to look at me, his eyes sharp and desperate. "Violet, you knew her at the orphanage. What does she want? Money?" "She doesn't want money, Father," I said calmly, setting my bag down. "She wants the script." Mr. Garrett blinked, confused. "What script?" "She wants to be the main character," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "She wants a public apology, a promise of marriage, and her name plastered across the gossip magazines as the poor girl who tamed the rich heir. She's been studying rom-coms her entire life." I walked over to the desk, pulling out my phone and displaying a video file. But she forgot that motels have security cameras. The video, which I had purchased from the motel manager for $1,000 of my allowance an hour ago, showed the entire scene. It showed Tiffany dragging a clearly intoxicated, semi-conscious Chad into the room, her face looking perfectly calm and calculating. It showed her setting up her own phone on a tripod to take the photos, and then leaving the room alone. 10 minutes later, without Chad even waking up. There was no romance. There was no pregnancy. There was only a cheap, clumsy attempt at corporate extortion. This, Mr. Garrett gasped, his face turning from anger to absolute relief. This is perfect. We can destroy her with this. We won't just destroy her, father, I said quietly, my golden eyes locked onto his. We will make sure she never has the strength to climb back into our lives again. The graduation ceremony was held on a bright, beautiful spring morning. The university quad was filled with families, white chairs lined up neatly on the green grass under the blue sky. The scent of blooming lilacs hung thick in the warm air, a perfect, picturesque scene of accomplishment. I stood on the stage, wearing my blue valedictorian gown, my silver medal clutched in my hand. Sophie stood beside me, her face glowing with a bright, beautiful smile, her hand tightly holding mine. We had both received full-ride scholarships to Harvard University, the top 2 students of the entire state. Mr. and Mrs. Garrett were sitting in the front row, clapping proudly, their faces beaming for the cameras. They looked like the picture of perfect, loving parents, though we all knew they only loved the glory my success brought to their brand. But at the back of the crowd, behind the security gates, stood a different figure. Tiffany was wearing a faded, oversized t-shirt, her face pale and hollow, her hands covered in deep scars from her work at the fast food grease fryers. Beside her stood Mr. and Mrs. Miller, their faces dark and angry, Mr. Miller holding a half-empty bottle of cheap beer in his paper bag. They were waiting for her to finish her shift, so they could take her remaining wages. When the ceremony ended, and the crowd began to disperse, I walked toward the parking lot, my valedictorian medal clutched in my hand. Violet. A voice called out from the shadow of the brick wall near the gymnasium. I stopped, turning slowly. Tiffany stood there. Her shoulders were sloped, her dark hair greasy and unkempt, her eyes filled with a raw, agonizing mixture of hatred, jealousy, and absolute, shattered confusion. Why? She whispered, her voice cracking as she took a trembling step toward me. Why did it go like this? I chose the Millers. I chose the loving family. I helped Chad. I cleaned the floors. I did everything the main character was supposed to do. She grabbed my sleeve, her fingers shaking, her voice rising into a hysterical shriek. I was supposed to be the one on that stage. I was supposed to be the one going to the Ivy League. Why are you the one who has everything, while I'm stuck in that hell with those abusive monsters? I looked down at her fingers on my silk gown. In our past life, I had spent years crying, starving, and working myself to the bone to survive her bullying, only to be run over by her car because she couldn't handle my silent happiness. I gently, slowly pulled my sleeve from her grip, my movement carrying a quiet, unshakable strength. Because you thought being the main character was about the script you were handed, Tiffany, I said, my voice quiet, flat, and completely cold. You thought that by choosing the poor but loving parents, you could sit back and wait for a rich boy to rescue you. You didn't realize that the Millers were monsters, and you didn't realize that Chad was a coward. I stepped closer, looking down into her hollow, terrified eyes. Being the main character isn't about what you're born into, Tiffany. It's about having the guts to rewrite the story when the script goes wrong. You had 3 years to study, to work, to save yourself. But you spent all of your energy trying to play the victim. I turned my back on her, walking toward the black sedan where Mr. and Mrs. Garrett were waiting for me, their driver holding the door open. Violet, please, she screamed behind me, her voice breaking as Mr. Miller grabbed her arm from behind, dragging her toward his rusted truck. Please save me. We're sisters. I didn't look back. I got into the passenger seat, the heavy door closing with a solid, final click, shutting out her screams, her tears, and her self-made hell forever. The car pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the highway that led to the airport, where the long, unwritten road of my future was finally waiting to be born.